Hi, guys. We're back here today again for the DisInformation Chronicle, and I have a good guest here today, Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Sarah Rogers, and she's going to talk to me a bit about the State Department's recent move to deal with people abroad who are censoring Americans. So right before Christmas, the State Department, it was like 2 days before Christmas, I was on Christmas vacation actually, they moved to revoke the visas of 5 individuals who've been caught censoring Americans. Can you explain to me a little bit about why did the State Department do this and why did they target these particular individuals?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the strong imperatives of this administration has been freedom of expression, particularly online. And we saw in the Murphy case and in some of your reporting and in the Twitter files reporting extensive documentation of an extensive web of censorship efforts by governmental actors, by NGOs that governments were funding to deploy, dozens, hundreds, thousands of staff to flag tweets and other social media content often posted by Americans, often discussing American domestic political issues, often raising political viewpoints that were adverse to the administration then in power. And the instruction emanating, whether directly from the government or from NGOs the government funded and controlled and colluded with, was these viewpoints should not be aired. They should be suppressed. And there was a whole Supreme Court controversy that was resolved on standing and not merits about whether that violated the First Amendment. But irrespective of whether it violates the First Amendment, and I think a lot of it did, why should taxpayer money be erecting an elaborate apparatus to suppress American speech? Especially American speech that might be true, like maybe the virus leaked from a lab, which we now know was the CIA's inclination as well, right? And so our administration has been firmly against that. And it's been a key plank of our foreign policy engagement and my foreign policy engagement because I deal with the same types of issues that the Global Engagement Center, the same types of issues that the censorship industrial complex were dealing with. I deal with the information environment and what, if any, hand should the government have in shaping the kind of speech people access and how they access it. My view is very laissez-faire about the government that all viewpoints should be heard and there should be no formal censorship, no informal censorship, none of it. And I've been engaging diplomatically to advance that view, and regulations coming out of Europe and the UK, particularly extraterritorial enforcement of those regulations transnationally online, are a big impediment to it. So that's the backdrop there. We issued sanctions, which I didn't intend to issue on Christmas Eve. I wasn't trying to blindside people at Christmas. It just,
Well, thank you
yeah,
so much because I was trying to
yeah,
chill out and then I was
yeah,
suddenly on X reading all this stuff and I was like,
yeah.
who is this woman? What's going on? Who are these people?
Mhm. Well, Paul, who some of the people are because you did some pretty intrepid reporting on them that
Yeah.
I referenced in my Twitter thread announcing the
Right.
sanction.
That's what I want to. So the one tweet you had that caught my attention, it was
Yeah.
actually on Imran Ahmed, and you tweeted. Here's what you wrote. You said Imran Ahmed, he collaborated with the Biden administration's efforts to weaponize U.S. government against U.S. citizens. He was part of the Disinformation Dozen report that targeted now HHS Secretary Kennedy, and leaked documents from CCDH show the organization listed kill Musk's Twitter and trigger EU and UK regulatory actions as priorities. Imran Ahmed, I've been reporting on this guy since 2023. And
Hmm.
what happened with me was I saw this group CCDH and they popped up out of nowhere. And I was like, who are these people? I mean, there are literally thousands of nonprofits operating out of DC. I spent 10 years in DC, partly on the Senate, then first as a reporter, then as a Senate investigator, then working at different NGOs as a freelance reporter. Let me just tell you something. It is almost impossible for a nonprofit to have their report be spoken from the podium of the White House. And I was like, okay, who is this group? Who are they? I tracked them back to London. It was a political operation set up by the Labour Party, Morgan McSweeney, Imran Ahmed. You guys, I think you came out and said you're going to revoke his visa. And I had thought, because I have some internal documents, I thought he'd actually already gotten American citizenship. And now I know that he's got a green card. Where are we at? What's his status on? So now you're going to revoke his visa. You're going to have to remove him from the country. Where are we at on that process?
So that's currently in litigation. Imran Ahmed sought an injunction against the secretary's whole policy and against his removal. There's a TRO issue that I understand addresses deportation, but not the rest of it. Because this is a piece of ongoing litigation being handled by another part of the government, the DOJ, I would get my colleagues in trouble and create work for them if I spoke on it because then these would become out of court opposite statements. And so I can't do that. I have to adhere to government policy. But basically, the sum and substance of it is, when people hear sanctions, there's a whole spectrum of tools in the US toolkit that we call sanctions. The most severe are the ones that target an entire nation, economy, or industry, like Russian or Iranian oil, for example. We didn't impose those here. And then there are very severe sanctions that can target individuals, what we call the Magnitsky sanctions, where you ban someone from the global financial system, really, and from transacting with any US company. So when you're Magnitsky sanctioned, your Gmail stops working, your Amazon stops working, your Visa card stops working, no matter where you are. And we didn't do that here either. But we also have a tool that we refer to as visa sanctions, which simply says, you can have various legal rights under various legal documents, but almost nobody has the right to be an invited guest on a visa in the United States. And the Supreme Court has long said that, the Secretary of State and the executive have significant discretion in, like, what kinds of visitors do we want to let into the country? And the criteria for revoking somebody's privilege to visit are pretty much the same as the criteria for admitting him in the first place. So when we visa sanction someone, we basically say, you're not welcome to visit us. And I think, here's a common sense way to look at it. And this doesn't capture the full spectrum of foreign policy considerations that were in front of the secretary when we issued these sanctions, but it's a pretty commonsensical one, which is, Paul, if you showed up at a consulate somewhere and applied for a visa to visit the United States, and they said, is the purpose of your visit business or pleasure? And you said, my purpose is to kill an American company for the
Right.
purpose of undermining American political rights, then America would be well within its rights to say, maybe we don't want you to be an invited guest.
Right.
And that appears to be what was going on here, with this added ingredient of kind of collusion with part of the American government and certainly with the British government for the purpose of, I think, interfering in American elections. So we're
Right.
still receiving leaked documents. I very much hope that this litigation produces some discovery from CCDH. I don't know that it's postured to, and I really have to defer to the lawyers on where it's going, but I'm very, very keen to learn more.
Well, it's really interesting. I was interviewed by the BBC about this issue because after they saw your tweet, then they realized I was the person behind the tweet. They interviewed me and they asked me these questions like, "Well, don't you want the American government to follow the rules?" And I was like, "I don't know what the rules are for
Yeah.
getting a visa in America. What I know is that I'm now a resident of Spain, and I would not violate the Constitution or the laws of Spain and expect to remain in Spain.
Right.
I mean, this seems kind of common sense to me."
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but the one thing I think that's interesting about this is, when you went after Imran Ahmed and the Center for Countering Digital Hate, this group was started in 2017 by Imran Ahmed and Morgan McSweeney, right? Who's probably the most powerful political operative right now in the United Kingdom, right? And he is actually the chief of staff to Kier Starmer, who's the prime minister. So you're knocking on the door of the prime minister's office. Like, have they responded in any way, either privately or that you can discuss in any way? I mean, they must know what's going on. They know that you're outside their office now.
Well, look, I mean, there are all kinds of diplomatic communications that happen publicly, privately, and I have had bilateral engagements with the British government that I think, to preserve their kind of efficacy and comedy, I'm not gonna divulge. But I think that our concerns are clear, and I think we have a very special relationship with the British government. We're a very important partner and vice versa. And I think it's evident that the issue has been communicated. I won't speculate, or I won't speculate and won't make promises about resolutions. But there's this whole bundle of kind of free speech digital rights issues bubbling up now that my office has been very engaged in. And when we imposed these sanctions, we didn't choose the most severe, and we didn't sanction the country, but we did say, these NGOs that were trying to construct like an Online Safety Act, Digital Services Act style government NGO joint venture center in the United States, we don't want that conduct here. That our foreign policy is against that. And I think that was a very important message, and I think it is an efficacious one.
And just so I don't think that even most of my readers know this, but the Online Safety Act that's the law that was passed in England. The first person to testify in favor of that in the British Parliament was Imran Ahmed. And the sponsor of that bill, who pushed it through, the MP, Damian Collins, he was on the board of the Center for Countering Digital
Yeah.
Hate. So this
Yeah.
is all an inside, game that's going on in London right now, which I
Yeah.
don't totally understand, but I'll get to that in a second. But there's also, sort of in line with what's happening in England, there's an email that I sent to you, and it's an email that came out from a leak of Labor Party emails in 2020. In 2021. And there's a 2020 email from Morgan McSweeney to Ben Rhodes, who's a former, he's a Democratic Party, advisor. He's now a columnist at the New York Times. And there's a woman CC'd on the email. She's now a senior advisor to Prime Minister Kier Starmer. So here's what the email says. I want to get your thoughts on this. It's from Morgan McSweeney, September 4th, 2020. And it says, Culture, Wars, and Values. It says, Hi, Ben. This is to Ben Rhodes. Hi, Ben. I hope you are well and enjoyed some kind of break during the summer. When we last spoke, me and David, I don't know who David is, mentioned that we have to set up a subcommittee of our shadow cabinet to approach polarization, right-wing culture wars, etc. Are you available to come and speak to our next meeting on September 14th at 5 p.m. London time? And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, why is the guy who's now the chief of staff to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom inviting a Democratic political operative over to discuss, essentially collaborate on how they're going to go after conservatives? Essentially, again, I'm wondering, it's the same kind of thing. Are they starting to try and interfere in our domestic politics?
I think it's a really sharp and interesting question. And I can tell you a piece of rhetoric that I have no patience for is when I'm accused of quote unquote interfering in European politics by being a voice for American interests and American values and sanctions imposed on American companies, right? Figurative sanctions in this case, but extortative fines. When the Labor Party, there was a Labor Party official who was bragging on social media about giving resources to the Kamala campaign.
Right.
And European officials have been very vocal on Twitter and other social media about events like January 6th and about their views of our president. Thierry Breton, another sanctions target, was an EU official, threatened. Everyone knows that it's widely known that he threatened Elon Musk, but
Right.
no one remembers what he threatened Elon Musk for. He threatened Elon Musk for daring to host an interview with our president. Now our president, Donald Trump.
Right. No, it was when he was running for. No, that email came back up again, and it shocked me. I saw it, that letter when I first came out. I saw it. I ignored it at the time, and I read it now, and I was like, what it essentially says is he's threatening Elon Musk with essential legal action if he's to host a presidential candidate, Donald Trump. And when I look at this, I'm like, how is this? How does not anyone perceive this as election interference?
Yeah. I mean, certainly the lingo of election interference gets thrown around a lot and it can mean different things. I try to keep my advocacy in Europe sort of issue focused, not candidate focused, not party focused. I'll often say, I'm not a Brit. I'm not going to vote in British elections, but I'm a voice for the United States. And when you try to eviscerate American political rights that we seized when we seceded from you 250 years ago via the extraterritorial enforcement of this regulation that we think is wrong-headed, we're going to respond. And the proposition from the people who raise this interference point disingenuously, it's almost like we get to apply British law in America and decide what speech is acceptable by Americans on American platforms. And if you object to that, you're interfering in our affair. It's very imperious. And I think if you were going to make an interference allegation, then certainly one foreign party colluding with a party here to suppress the American right would come much closer. I think that there have been a lot of attempts to chill speech by invoking this vague specter of foreign interference. And I am generally leery of that, but certainly colloquially that email, if it proves to be authentic, and I've heard no info to the contrary, that to me supports an interference allegation more than just, you're interfering by making Twitter videos that we don't like.
Right. So when all this came out, my understanding is in late December, you had been on a delegation, I guess, of State Department officials had been on sort of a tour around Europe. What were you guys doing and where'd you guys go and what was that all about?
So I went there for a variety of engagements. I was only confirmed in October because I was nominated like a year ago, but it took a while to get in because the confirmation process was log jammed and then the government was shut down when I got in. So,
well, I can add in a little bit of this. I know exactly what's going on. There's a certain senator who doesn't know what he's doing, and I won't name him.
Well, I certainly won't name any senators to that end, but because I value my relationships with all of them. They're all great. But so I finally get in and the government shut down, and then the shutdown finally ends, and I get to take an official trip, and I go to Europe for a mix of free speech, digital freedom engagements and cultural engagements. So my office, the Public Diplomacy Office, oversees what was formerly the domain of the Global Engagement Center, oversees sort of the information environment, digital freedom, that stuff, but we also oversee a lot of the America 250, Freedom 250 upcoming semi-quincentennial celebrations, which means our quarter century birthday, and all of the cultural engagements like repatriating archaeological artifacts and things like that. So I was in Europe for a mixed itinerary, and it just so happened that I was over there when the EU X-Fine dropped. And because when the EU X-Fine dropped, there were statements on social media that I found risible by European politicians, I responded to one of them just talking into my phone, and that video went quite viral. That became kind of the dominant takeaway from my trip. That's what the trip is known for. But I went to the opera with the Italian Minister of Culture. I met with the Italian Carabinieri and looked at this incredible warehouse of stolen and repatriated art and artifacts from ancient Rome that
Oh,
I
wow.
was a privilege to see them. I was in France. I attended the launch party at the Paris Embassy for Freedom 250 for our quarter century birthday in this glorious Parisian palace that is now our ambassador's residence that we
Wow.
helped rescue from the Nazis during World War II. There were like uniformed French and American colonial era military reenactors there, and that was a fantastic event. I oversee sports diplomacy. I had dinner with the owners of some NBA and NFL teams, and we talked about sports opportunities. So my one complaint about that trip is that it was exhausting. Schedule was very dense. It was basically a city a day, but I was there for bilateral free speech engagements and then cultural engagements, and I did both.
So you did this one interview with GB News, where
Mhm.
you were talking about the problems with European censorship.
Yeah.
What is it like when you're having meetings with these? I mean, I know a little bit about just from friends. I don't know a lot about State Department. I know very little about State, but I know a little bit. I know before you even go to these meetings, there's an advanced team that's doing security and protocols. So you're not going to walk into a room that's not all scripted. You're going to meet a counterpart. It's like, well, she's a undersecretary for public diplomacy. She can't meet with this person. That person's too big for her. She has to meet with this person. There's all these kind of, you're smiling, like there's all these little things that go
Yeah.
on, making sure who sits where and all this kind of stuff.
Oh
What
my
was it
God.
like when you're talking to these people and you're explaining to them about the fact that, we are not doing this. I mean, I know you didn't say it, like, guys, we're done with the censorship. How
Right.
did those conversations take place, and what did you get back from them? Were they from their just visually what they were, facial expressions and stuff? Were they getting it, or
I
how did the
think
conversation go?
I don't want to give play-by-plays of private meetings because I want to be able to have candid exchanges with these people, and I wouldn't want them reciting everything I said either. What I will say, I was kind of laughing when you were talking about how hierarchical and formal a lot of State Department stuff is, because that's totally true. And I
Yeah.
remember the first week I got in here, I tried to dial into some meeting that wasn't supposed to involve me, and it caused chaos because the undersecretary wants to join, and now it's an undersecretary level meeting. And I really just wanted
Wow.
to listen in, but you acclimate to that very quickly. And I'm worried that when I leave this job, all of my muscles for informal engagement are going to be atrophied, and I'm going to be relying on a retinue to tell me where to go and where to sit at all times. But in these meetings, I didn't just want to have a ritualized representational engagement where you stand there and get your picture taken and sign something ceremonial. I wanted to engage with people who knew and enforced the nuts and bolts of these regulations. And I was a mix of, I did some of that and some kind of high level, like sometimes my counterpart is the culture minister, and I met with a couple of culture ministers. And I would say that when you bring up, as I did in the viral video, the edge case applications of European censorship laws, like what is the practical reality? The practical reality is that if you blaspheme Islam, you can get arrested. The practical reality is that if you post true statistics about migrant crime, you can get arrested. The practical reality in some European countries is if you call a politician fat or an asshole, you can get arrested.
Right.
And particularly in Britain, there have been some really excessive instances that nobody defends. And I think that even when you bring this stuff up privately to regulators, there's not an aggressive defense of it. It's more like I think people want to resolve the conflict. They want to reach a consensus. And there's a view that maybe we have to stick up for our sovereignty in the face of American big tech. But I think a point that my engagements have tried to make is these censorship laws don't primarily target large tech companies. A lot of the speech that is targeted to be suppressed it's not X's speech, it's not Meta's speech. It's the speech of some user on one of those platforms
Right.
who has offended
Right.
the European political consensus. And even when you apply these censorship laws offline to like the German woman who calls the rapist a pig. I don't think she did it on a social media platform, but she goes to jail. The rapist doesn't because she used a naughty word, and the rapist just committed gang rape, so he's free.
Right.
That's the reality of European censorship, and nobody did
I
that.
It's funny you're repeating this, and I guarantee you there's people listening to this,
Yeah,
Americans, that aren't gonna believe what you're saying. When I actually wrote about this, and I sent it to my editor, and my editor was, "We need to cite some," like, happened. It was right there.
yeah.
It literally happened. You just can't believe that this stuff is happening.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's absurd. And I think Europeans, one thing that a lot of Americans take for granted because they're not lawyers and they haven't read, centuries of First Amendment jurisprudence is we have this very careful record of judges thinking in a very specific way about the First Amendment and how it's applied. And one of the principles in that jurisprudence is you can't have vague laws that impose a chilling effect. So you couldn't make a statute that just says really bad internet posts about children are illegal. Even though a
Right.
lot of normal people, that would jive with them on an intuitive level. Like, of course, really bad stuff about children shouldn't be
Right.
online. In practice, unless you know exactly what is going to be enforced against, especially in the speech domain, we don't allow those vague, sweeping, chilling laws. And one
Right.
reason we don't allow them is because when you make vague laws, especially then you ask big risk averse corporations to enforce them, you're going to get over enforcement and people aren't going to be certain if they're going to be arrested for their speech, so they just don't say anything at all. Countries that don't have that First Amendment chilling effect tradition don't have the kinds of statutory interpretation principles we do that require certain kinds of laws to be very specific and give very specific notice, and don't have, as we do, the common law tradition where you can read reams of court opinions and see exactly how the same line of the same law is applied. I don't think they foresee that. So a lot of times what you hear is, well, when we wrote the law, we didn't intend for the cops to behave this way. This was just, one law enforcement officer or one local council member or one regulator applying
I
the
see.
vague law in a way we didn't intend. And the point that I've tried to make is if you don't intend to chill lawful speech, don't write vague laws censoring speech.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, on two issues on that. First off, I don't think most Americans even know this, but like, there are, I believe, at least two Supreme Court decisions that that say that hate speech is
Mhm.
protected
Oh, yeah.
speech.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that you brought up is, I actually was speaking about this with on a similar vein with a reporter, one of the fact checking reporters at the BBC. And I asked her, I said, let me, you've done all these fact checks on vaccines about different things. Have you ever fact checked one of the vaccine companies? Because they've gotten things wrong a lot of times. And it just got quiet. And it was like, well, I plan on doing this. And then she never did.
Yeah.
So that's the whole thing that's always bothered me. Why are you fact checking some mom in Oshkosh,
Right.
Wisconsin, who's got 2,000 followers on Facebook,
Yeah.
and you're not fact checking a major corporation that puts out falsehoods and we know they put out falsehoods because this is an industry with vaccines, for instance, that has, prior to the settlement with British Petroleum, they had paid more in fines than any other industry in the history of the United States. So I've
Yeah.
always thought that was very odd.
And there's just something sinister and weird to me about having millions or billions of taxpayer dollars spent fact checking a mom in Oshkosh, Wisconsin with 2,000 followers. And often that was what was happening. And I don't think fact checking is an entirely sinister enterprise. Like I've said positive things about the community notes that X has rolled out.
Right.
And I'm not praising even that platform specifically, but just the general idea of tools that help people evaluate the veracity and authenticity of content they're seeing. I think what we want to avoid, the kind of fact checking that users are able to do together in real time is good. I think the kind of fact checking that I'm leery of is where you deputize some ideologically skewed NGO to sit somewhere upstream of the information of the informed public and curate what they're allowed to see. Like make
Right.
a blacklist of websites that have edgy information on them that should never be allowed to exist, or that shouldn't be allowed to have any ad revenues that's not allowed to exist. And one of the NGOs that we sanctioned, one of the websites they targeted was the website Unheard, which is kind of I would say like a centrist, kind of slightly anti-woke website, but it's not some crazy propaganda outlet. It's
I've
not
written
some
for them.
conspiracy
I've written
digest.
I've
Yeah.
written for them. So
Yeah,
yeah,
you've
they're
written for
they're
them.
good.
They're like, I think they're like respectable. And they were demonetized because they featured the same exact reporting of the same exact facts and claims about pediatric sex change medicine that we now know are true, that a lot of governments
Right.
concur are true. They were censoring that stuff in Britain, and then the British CAS report comes out and says, no, they're right. And so even by the admission of these establishments in these countries, they're censoring true information.
Right, right. Now, after you come out noting the sanctions against these 5 people, I mean, the social media is lit up. All the Twitters and everything went crazy. I saw some crazy tweets by some British
Yeah,
politicians out of the EU, different
yeah.
countries, and everything. Is this, I mean, I'm sure I don't talk about specifics. I can't even remember specifics. But are you seeing people saying things, one thing publicly on X or whatever, and then what really is being said behind the scenes is different? Are there two messages happening? Because that's what I wondered immediately.
Look, people always modulate their style and sometimes their talking points privately versus publicly. And it's not, to my knowledge, it's not like there's this blatant divergence and the real message behind the curtain is different. It's just that when you say things publicly as a government official, you have to clear them with a whole bunch of people, and it's more careful and more ritualized, and you can be more candid face to face. But I think that it's fair to say social media is for big public messaging. It's not for careful negotiation. If I had a 50-point list of like requested statutory tweaks to something, tweeting that would be bizarre, right? It wouldn't be the format for it. So when we engage on X, we use X for what it's best at, which is the kinds of engagements you've seen there. And when we have diplomatic meetings, we don't
Fighting,
do we don't
fighting.
do it we don't do it in the form of blustery tweets. But that's not to say that my message in diplomatic meetings is substantively that different. Like I'm a genuine ideologue on these issues. And I'm in this government as a representative of this president, the secretary, and the voters who put them in office. So it's my job to carry their priorities. You can see from our executive orders, this is a sincere administration priority.
So you've kind of laid this out, but I just want to go back over this again. Like, if the sort of these actions taken against these 5 individuals, if this doesn't suffice to send the message, what are the next steps that America can take? I mean, we've got some. Look, they arrested, I think, something like 12,000 people for speech
Yep.
issues in England in 2025, I believe, or was that 2024?
Yep.
I mean, England is
Last
just
year.
crazy. I have a friend of mine who's reporting out what's happening in Germany. Germany, there's stuff that's really, really, you can't even believe some of this stuff. If the message is not being you know seethed properly, what are some next step? I think you already hinted already that there can be, what would you say, McGinsky? Um,
Magnitsky. So
yeah,
Magnitsky is like the harshest sanction in our arsenal that was pioneered for use against specific Russians implicated in human rights abuses, allegedly including torture and murder. And that's been applied, in select other instances too, against certain people in the International Criminal Court. That was applied for a while against a judge in Brazil who was engaging in really censorious overreach. And then the president kind of made a deal to relax some of that. But we have other sanctions tools in our arsenal. We are engaged in a lot of trade negotiations with these countries, and I think this is not just a cultural civilizational issue, the free speech thing. It is a commercial issue because we're trying to develop AI with the EU or the UK, right? Then if it's the case that your LLM is not allowed to even potentially emit a response which a European regulator thinks is hate speech, then that fetters the development of AI in a way that is
right.
antagonistic to some of our priorities. So I think that's a piece in the mix. And I think I don't want to say anything that would be perceived as a threat of escalation. I will say that part of the State Department was recently reorganized during the Doge days, and we got rid of some stuff, but we move some stuff around, and I oversee an office called Digital Freedom, which has historically and continues to provide VPNs to dissidents and things like that. And I see no principled reason why I would facilitate uncensored internet access in Iran or Venezuela, but not in other countries that choose to erect censorious firewalls if in fact those countries choose to do it.
Right. Now, back to my favorite country now, England, in
Yeah.
part because I just know them better because they speak our language, so I can
Yeah.
follow them more closely what's going on there. Keir Starmer is now talking about that he's going to cut off X, Elon Musk's company. And now the particular reason why is because they're using the AI there to generate images of women where you take a picture of a woman and you just make her naked. It's happened with children too, I think.
Yeah.
But I'll be honest with you, like I think that that's a pretext for what they really want to do is they just want to go after Elon. Every time Kier Starmer tweets, he's getting community noted.
Yeah.
He's not doing really well on X. He's getting beat up on X a lot. I think he's looking for something to do. If they do move in that direction, how do you think America's going to respond?
Look, I think we've already seen, I will be very surprised, and you can post this on the internet and wield it against me if I end up having to be surprised. I'll be surprised if they really erect a China or Iran or Russia style ban of X where they like actually firewall this app that a lot of their citizens like and use. I think that we've seen two different directions of rhetoric from the British government. We've seen a threat, an insinuation of banning X, and then we've seen let's ban non-consensual sexual imagery. And I think the latter approach is one that's a lot more intuitive to a lot of people. Now, that doesn't mean that you want to ban it in a clumsy way. You want to be very careful with this kind of regulation. So I think when it comes to children, I don't think there's anyone who disagrees. I don't even think Elon Musk disagrees based on his public behavior. I think the images that people, and these weren't like nude pornographic images of children, but they were inappropriate, disgusting images.
Right.
It was like replace the child's outfit with a bikini. And you might
Right.
see a child in a two-piece bathing suit at the beach, but taking somebody's family photo of their kid and in that context doing that, I think is completely disgusting and deplorable.
Right.
And I think everyone who did that, my understanding is they were banned pretty much instantly. With adults, it's more complicated. There's a tradition of political cartooning. I'm a
Right.
public figure. People have made all kinds of X images of me. And it might be more comfortable to live in a world where like no one can ever render you in a fake bikini, but if that's at the cost of AI getting lobotomized or entire social media platforms getting banned, then I just think the bikini is not as bad. And I don't mean that to sound callous. That is the
Right.
trade-off you make in a free society, that sometimes you as an adult, not a kid, but an adult, you have to be willing to be a little uncomfortable in order to be free. And
Right.
I think that's the direction we should err in, and that has been my message. But the First Lady has a statute called the Take It Down Act that I think comes closer to what is appropriate, which is you empower the victim of the image to seek the remedy. You don't have a sweeping surveillance apparatus that goes around looking for things that are inappropriate. And you certainly don't ban an entire platform because the AI does something unacceptable for like 24 hours.
Right. Yeah. So this is not you're not a lifelong government employee. You come out of I don't know what you want to call it, big law, New York
Yeah.
law. You're an attorney out of New York.
Yeah.
And in that private practice, you did a couple of a couple of cases that kind of run up into some of these First Amendment issues. One of them involved an issue called debanking, which we
Yeah.
hear about a little bit. You read a couple stories about it.
Yeah.
What exactly is debanking? What was the specific issue that you ran into, and how does that interface with sort of First Amendment? I mean, I was shocked when I first heard that they can come
Yeah.
in and say you can't have a bank, and I was like,
Yeah.
whoa, can they do that to me? Because I
Yes.
mean, I was tweeting stuff
Yeah.
trying to get banned off of X, and I was like, can
Yeah.
they come after my bank? So what is this all about? This debanking thing?
So debanking gets invoked to mean a lot of different things, and it's a messy sphere to write and read about because banks can function bureaucratically and you might lose access to your bank account for all kinds of reasons, like maybe a check bounced or something. But debanking refers to, I think colloquially and in my First Amendment case, certainly viewpoint-based deprivation of financial services. And it can refer to companies doing this like sua sponte for ESG reasons or because the government told them to. In the case that I litigated, which obviously I'm no longer a counsel on this, I no longer have anything to do with it because I'm in the government, I only represent the government. But what I represented, the National Rifle Association, there's this pretty explosive set of facts that arises after the Parkland shooting in 2018, where New York regulators decide that people with the NRA's views about guns should not be able to access financial services in New York. There was official regulatory guidance issued by the New York DFS, which is a very powerful financial regulator because like every financial institution touches New York, or like most of them do.
Right.
Basically saying that under the institutional risk frameworks that all these institutions had to adopt, that doing business with gun promotion organizations like the NRA, which doesn't sell guns really, it
Yeah,
promotes
Is
guns from
is
a
is
First Amendment perspective.
is this group DFS? Is this a partisan group, or is it behaving in a partisan manner? I'm
It
trying
was
to.
behaving in a partisan manner. I think that is
Okay.
clear.
Okay.
This was, the posture of the case when it went to the Supreme Court was that there was a complaint before the court that alleged a set of facts, and the argument was, let us prove these facts in discovery and then let us win. And the Second Circuit had reached, I think, the pretty risible conclusion that even if everything the NRA alleged was true, then there was no First Amendment violation, that the banking regulator can just go around with this cudgel and say, if you support guns, you can't have insurance. Like that was pretty much the argument, and that would be fine. And the Supreme Court said no, actually that violates the law, and it was a unanimous Supreme Court that said that. So what we have is a Supreme Court precedent that says the government can't pressure financial institutions to do viewpoint-based debanking. Now, whether financial institutions can do viewpoint-based debanking on their own just because they decide they're woke or whatever is a more complicated legal issue. I think the right regulatory approach to take is probably to discourage that. And in Europe, it's further complicated because all of these companies subscribe to these complicated compliance management systems that flag account holders they shouldn't have. And there's all kinds of reasons that people could be sanctioned by a government or have their accounts flagged. Like maybe you sent a wire transfer that went to a sanctioned country, or they're concerned you may
Right.
be trading Iranian oil or something. And so in Europe, if you get criminally flagged by the government for something like hate speech, then it is entirely plausible that some compliance vendor picks that up, tells a financial institution that you're a criminal, and that financial institution, without ever reading your tweet or forming an opinion about your speech, just goes, oh, I better drop his bank account. He's a criminal. So this is my office. I'm looking at what my office can do on this. I think at minimum, we want to do some reporting on it and increase understanding of this issue and maybe make some recommendations. But it absolutely touches the First Amendment space, and it is poorly understood, but could become more salient in the future.
So in America, we're seeing this really, stark divide on censorship. I can't remember the latest poll that I've seen, but I'll just tell you something. As a guy,
Yeah.
born in Southern California in the 70s, grew up in the Reagan 80s, my concern was always the damn Republicans are kind of going to come and get you. They were telling you the music you can listen to, what kind of sex you can have and this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And now here we are right now. And the liberals are telling you what you can say. It's
Yeah.
a very weird thing for me. And it took many years for me to wrap my head around it, that this is what was happening. And so we've got this very stark divide where the people who want to control speech, I'm not
Yeah.
saying it's always just on the left, but
Right.
predominantly now at this point in history, where we're at right now in history, it's the people who are more to the left. Are we seeing that same kind of thing in Europe? And why do you think that is? Like, I mean, I don't know if you've thought about it, historically. I'm not just talking about legally, but historically also. Like, is that the way it is in Europe too? And how do we get to this point where
I
this is where
think
it's
I
getting
think
dark?
the American sort of progressive slash left constituency, the censorship constituency here, and the European one are aligned a bit, as you see in the emails. You see
Right,
Amy Klobuchar and Ben Rhodes like coordinating with these guys. They kind of
right.
want the same thing. And I think the reason they want it, one reason they want it, there's a book by Martin Gurry that came out in 2014 called Revolt of the Public. I don't know if you've read that.
No,
So Gurry is a former CIA media analyst, and I wouldn't say that you need to read his book now because everything he predicts back then is totally obvious in hindsight because it all came true. But I commend his foresight because it hadn't come true yet. And what he says about online speech is that it's not useful to segment it by right and left, but rather by center and periphery. So you have legacy
right,
institutions like the CDC or the New York Times or the
right,
European Union that have always had the ability to communicate to a pliant mass who can't talk back. And
right,
now on social media, the public, the populist riffraff, can coagulate into these little internet tribes and polarize for or against things, usually against. And when that happens, suddenly there are going to be moments, no matter how good your institutions are, where that institutional emperor lacks clothes, where the CDC gets something wrong, where the New York Times does some hysterical article saying that like tuna sandwiches are racist, which
right,
maybe a little, or like they did a lot of those.
right,
And when the public is able to amass in the Twitter replies and point that out, it creates a very different structure of communication. So that's Gurry's insight. And I think the reason that we went from the Republican moral majority wanting to censor music to the progressive moral majority wanting to censor the internet is that part of the progressive left, whatever you want to call it, viewpoint, that became the civic religion of the American establishment. Like
Right.
after the 1960s, the progressive boomers basically won. There's
Yeah.
this whole civil rights ideology and all of this. So that's the reason. And especially during COVID, the sort of dissent against the establishment became right-wing coded. And so you have your center periphery alignment.
Yeah, it's interesting you say it like that because that was the one thing that came across to me. It was not clear to me at first, but when I first reported on Center for Countering Digital Hate, the group run by Imran Ahme, who you sanctioned, the thing I noticed about him that I came away with was that the people who are censored, there's this idea that it's the conservatives that are censored. It's not. The power is center left.
Yeah.
And anyone who's to the left of that or to the right of the center
Mhm.
left orthodoxy is at risk of being censored. There are people on the left that are censored. It's just that
Yeah.
we're just not hearing that much from them.
Yeah.
It's the louder conservatives more on the right who are sort of dominating the conversation saying, stop the censorship stuff.
I I think free speech has become a right-wing coded concern.
Oh, exactly. Oh,
So
yes.
Andrea Long Chu, who's probably the most prominent trans writer, did this piece in New York Magazine that basically said Palestine activists are getting censored, but we should stop pretending we care about free speech. We only care about free speech for Palestine. And I think that was honest. I think that the left, even when their speech is suppressed, they're less likely to express that complaint in First Amendment terms because they think the First Amendment is for right-wing chuds.
Right. What is the status? What is this? There's a long history of USAID was shut down. It's interesting. I never really understood it, but yeah, to me, it was really interesting watching this happening. And I was like, it was such a weird thing to watch because historically, people on the left hated USAID because they saw it. I think in many ways we know it's true. It was a front for the CIA. And then that's historically going back to the '60s. Then now we're in this new time frame in the last 10 years or so where conservatives start to not like it over spending. It's not about an ideologically thing. It's just basically we've got to conserve money and we're spending money on this stuff. And I remember when there were protests in favor of USAID when they were shutting it down, I was laughing with a friend of mine. I said, the only people out there, their only constituency now for USAID is a Democratic voter who lives within an hour of DC and can drive in for a protest. Like that's who they have. They've lost the real left. They've lost the conservatives. No one has them anymore. Now, part of that money has been folded into state. Are you running some of those parts? I was trying to understand that.
So I am running it's understandable to confuse that a bit because I run a lot of the soft power stuff, which USAID was very adjacent to. There's actually a bureau called Foreign Assistance now within the State Department, and the United States is still the most generous country in the world when it comes to things like AIDS treatment or earthquake relief. By and large, we're there to a greater extent than anyone else. It's just that we don't want that foreign assistance administered through this unaccountable kind of NGO apparatus. We want those dollars spent directly where possible. We want them aligned with American foreign policy, and we want them to be spent efficiently and with the goal of teaching people to fish or helping them build a factory rather than nurturing indefinite dependence. And some organizations that are not traditionally big fans of the administration, like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Atlantic, have both evaluated our foreign assistance efforts in the wake of that reorganization and found they were surprisingly, from their perspective, surprisingly good, right? So the person running that is called Jeremy Lewin. He's very, very smart. He came in as one of the Doge guys, and he was on Ross Douthat, I think, earlier in 2025. But I'm not in charge of that, but I do work with Jeremy.
Okay. And so Trump's making these changes and you're helping to push through these changes. Okay. And partly you're able to do this because there was, as they say, elections have consequences. A new president came in,
Yeah.
took a lot of the stuff in the state apart. We have elections. Elections have consequences. There could be another election come along. All this stuff could be kicked aside. We could bring a lot of the censorship stuff back. Is there any attempt that you're aware of to try to codify some of this stuff through legislation? I mean, I'm a former Senate staffer and I know it's a damn mess. But is
Yeah.
there any attempt, or is there any calls off the hill for them to try to work with you guys to get some of this stuff codified, like in law?
Absolutely, and I think one of the most powerful things we can do, there's a 2010 statute, is one of those statutes with an acronym, and it's called the Speech Act. And it basically says that certain foreign judgments which offended the First Amendment are not enforceable here. The most prominent example is British defamation judgments, because they, in their defamation libel cases, they allocate their proof burdens differently, and they make a few other changes which had been abused in the past through sort of litigation tourism to obtain libel judgments that wouldn't have been available under the First Amendment. So I think that if British libel law is anathema to the First Amendment, then the Online Safety Act and the hate speech type laws that it incorporates and applies to the internet are certainly in violation. And I believe that there are a number of people on the Hill who are looking at amending the Speech Act to cover that. There's a state level version of the statute called the Granite Act that's been proposed in a few different states. So this is certainly something that's being talked about. And obviously we hope for a successful ticket in 2028, but it is a democracy and elections do recur and they do have consequences. And I'm not going to be in this job forever. So I'm trying to do things that will outlast me. And one of the great things we can do is we can just generate information on things. We have incredible resources in this government and we have authority and imprimatur. So if I can issue a white paper on debanking that rationalizes what's happening and where and how, that's going to survive an after.
So just kind of looking towards the future, what can governments do? Or do you think, I mean, it's really weird. Like I had never really thought about this First Amendment free speech thing until the last handful of years as this stuff, the whole censorship stuff, the machinery is kind of accrued sort of slowly over time, starting, I'd say like 2012, 2016, it started coming up
Yeah.
more and more. It was really weird to watch because then suddenly it was all around you and you were kind of like, wait, what's going on? And like, how did this start? I remember I was trying to look back historically. What can we do in the future to make this, you just kind of deal with this stuff? Or do you think like this is going to happen? If these things are going to move back and forth? We got the left start trying to censor us now. Could be the conservatives 20 years from now. I think that maybe that's the way it is. It just kind of moves in waves. What's your thoughts on this?
I hate the phrase arc of history, but if you look at the long arc, the free speech norms now are generally more robust than they were during like the Spanish Inquisition. Certainly they became more robust in the United States starting in the modern era because the incorporation doctrine applied the First Amendment to the states. And I think that we've gone forward, not back in most respects in terms of our announced and especially our legal norms. The problem is that we increasingly have spaces where those announced legal norms don't govern every censorship decision or every piece of power that's exercised to curate or stud the public square. I do think speech is more democratized than it's been in recent memory. You have a lot of noise, you have what people are starting to call slop, which is a whole other thing. Discourse is slop. But I think that the censorship battle is not over. But I think the First Amendment objectively is in really good shape. And that in the internet info environment, I think we're figuring this stuff out. And I think we have different intuitions and answers on it than some other regulators do. And it's my job to fight persuasively for those answers because persuasion is how you win in a free society that has free speech.
All right, Sarah, thank you so much for coming on. And I wish you the best in the future. Okay, bye-bye.